Nikolas Cruz, the profoundly disturbed young man who carried out a massacre in the hallways of his former high school 4 years ago, igniting an anti-gun violence movement led by students raised in an era of mass shootings, should not be condemned to die, and instead should spend the rest of his life in prison, said a state jury on Thursday. The jury of 7 men and 5 women decided that Mr. Cruz should get life in prison without the possibility of parole for all 17 first-degree murder counts in this case, following less than a day of deliberations and a grueling and often emotional sentencing trial. Relatives of the victims appeared horrified and baffled as they learned that Mr. Cruz's life had been spared. In contrast, Mr. Cruz, 24, showed little emotion as Judge Elizabeth Scherer announced the jury's decision. Mr. Cruz pleaded guilty last year to fatally shooting 17 people and injuring 17 others in the afternoon of February 14, 2018, in the freshman building of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. The jury trial, which started in July, focused solely on whether Mr. Cruz should receive the death penalty as prosecutors requested or life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a rare legal proceeding against a gunman in a mass shooting. Most either killed themselves or died in a confrontation with the police during attacks. In 2017, a federal jury recommended death for the white supremacist who killed 9 black churchgoers in Charleston, South Carolina, 2 years before the man accused of killing 23 people in 2019 inside of a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, is awaiting trial after pleading not guilty. As Judge Scherer read out the jury's decision, one by one Thursday, people in the Florida courtroom, including the parents of many of the Parkland victims, looked angry and disturbed. They shook their heads and whispered to one another. Several dabbed at their eyes. Later, as they left the courtroom, some relatives of the victims sobbed loudly. "The monster that killed him gets to live another day," said Tony Montaldo, whose 14-year-old daughter, Gina, was among the 17 murdered victims. Calling the jury's decisions pretty unreal, he added, "Society really has to look at and re-examine who and what is a victim." Dr. Elon Aldef, whose daughter Alyssa, was also 14, was murdered in the shootings, said he was disgusted with the jury and the legal system. "What did we have the death penalty for?" he said. Judge Scherer said that the sentencing would take place at a hearing on November 1st. Victims' families will be given the chance to speak before formal sentencing is entered. Under Florida law, the judge has no power to overrule a jury and impose a death penalty on her own. Mr. Cruz had been willing to plead guilty in exchange for a life sentence since shortly after the shooting. His defense lawyer said, but the chief prosecutor in Broward County at the time, Michael J. Saltz, a Democrat, said he would pursue the death penalty. Many of the victims' families in the liberal bastion of Broward County also supported capital punishment in this case. The defendant ultimately entered a guilty plea despite the possibility of a death sentence. Mr. Satz was no longer the elected state attorney and remained the lead prosecutor on the case. Prosecutors argued during the trial that the gravity of Mr. Cruz's crimes is laid on the aggravating factors under Florida law justify the death penalty. But for the court to impose a death sentence, jurors had to agree unanimously to recommend it for the murder of at least one of the victims. To do that, jurors had to determine that there were aggregating factors connected with the killing and that they outweighed the troubling circumstances that shaped Mr. Cruz's life, including the death of his adopted mother from pneumonia about 4 months before his attacks. Instead, at least one juror appears to have been persuaded that Mr. Cruz's life should have been spared because of the defense argued. His brain was damaged before birth. His biological mother, the defense said, was a prostitute who drank heavily, smoked, and according to some witnesses, also abused drugs while she was pregnant with him. That Mr. Cruz's lawyer said left him suffer from fetal alcohol spectrum disorder that was never properly diagnosed despite his many developmental delays and behavioral problems. Mr. Cruz arrived at Stoneman Douglas High School, a sprawling campus in the affluent Broward County suburbs, around his dismissal time on Valentine's Day in 2018, armed with a legally purchased semi-automatic rifle and more than 300 rounds of ammunition. He charged in the building 12, shooting 139 rounds down the hallway into classrooms. He fired at students who tried to flee and sometimes doubled back to make sure his victims were dead. He killed 14 students and 3 faculty members in just under 6 minutes, stopping only after he could not find anyone else to kill, he said later, before escaping on foot. Killed in the shootings were Alyssa Aldef, Scott Beagle, Martin Duque, Nicholas DeWitt, Eris Fies, Jamie Gutenberg, Christopher Hickson, Luke Hoyer, Cara Lauren, Gina Motado, Joaquin Oliver, Alina Petty, Meadow Pollock, Helena Ramsey, Alex Schnetter, Carmen Schintrup, and Peter Wang. My apologies if I mispronounced any of those names. May the victims rest in peace. May the families find solace. And may justice be found against Nikolas Cruz. As always, can look for the history in film. My heart goes out to the families, the victims, and the communities of Parkland, Florida. As always, can look for the history in film. Have a great day, everyone.